So we're going to now consider the evidence from that study about commuting and political engagement. And it was a good study, as I mentioned. It had used good methods and had good data, and the researchers essentially discovered a link between a presumed independent variable, which is commuting, and a presumed dependent variable, which was political engagement. So, we often use X to represent the independent variable and Y to represent the dependent variable. And in that kind of framework, X is typically thought of as the presumed cause, and Y is the presumed effect. And again, the data was good, the methods were good, and they did indeed find a link that more commuting, when X went up, more lengthier commutes, longer commutes, when that when people experience that, they also reported lower political engagement. So as X went up, commuting times went up, political engagement, people's political engagement went down. So if you recall from the theory chapter, that's a negative relationship. It was a fairly strong negative relationship and fairly good data from good methods. So now, now the question is, though, is that evidence of real cause and effect? It's a real relationship. There's a real relationship between commuting and political participation. The question is it a causal relationship, and in particular, is commuting longer distances causing sort of the decline in political participation in the United States? Now, that's the framework that the authors were using, or the researchers were using. That's the theory that was of interest, and that was the focus of the journalist coverage of the study. But what we need to now do is think carefully about what alternative explanations there could be for the data, for the evidence. So so one possibility is X is causing Y, right? It could be that commuting does influence people's political participation, and the authors mentioned some plausible reasons for that, having to do with the time it takes away from people's lives, but also the probably more importantly, or what they suggest is more important, is the stress and sort of um, um, the stress and kind of mental fatigue that comes with long commutes. Now, but let me point out another possibility. Whenever you hear about a correlation like that, it's useful to think of, just turn things around and think of um, um, the other possibility, or another possibility, which is that things could work the other way around, and we call this reverse causation. And it could be that, or at least consider the fact that it might be possible that Y is causing X. So let's think about that in this study. So if it's true that people who are attached to their communities and involved in their local politics are less willing to commute long distances, and people who are less engaged in politics and sort of more alienated from their local civic culture, if they're more willing to move away from the city center or whatever, and accept longer commutes, then it could be that part of this relationship that the authors discovered in their survey, part of that could be why, you know, political engagement, or interest in political engagement influencing in commuting times. And so that's a possibility. Well, another possibility to think about is what's known as a common cause. So here we have our relationship between X and Y, commuting and political engagement. We might want to think about some possible variables that are driving or causing both X and Y. So and just consider whether those sorts of variables might be a factor in this study and in this situation. So 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 these are called common causes. So what would that be? So would have to be something that influences people's commuting times, and at the same time influences their political participation. And if it's a joint cause of both X and Y, then it may produce sort of a correlation between X and Y without there being any real, causal connection. So let me suggest an example here. So what if, let's think of something like the life cycle effects, like the presence of children, maybe in particular. Okay, so families, adults, move through the life cycle, begin as young people, end as older people. But in between, many people raise families and have children and childcare responsibilities. Now, if that's a possible common cause, then let's think about what might happen. So, people in the child rearing age of their life, they may be more likely to commute, right? Because they need more space. They want a backyard for the kids to play in. They want good schools for the kids to go to. So they're willing to kind of move out of the city, away from the jobs in the city center, look for a house with a yard near a good school, and the longer commute is the price for that sort of lifestyle. So if that's a tendency in the population, then it could be that having children or being in the child rearing phase of life would be positively associated with commuting times. Having children and being in the child rearing part of life would lead to longer commutes, as opposed to younger people who would have shorter commutes, and maybe even older people who might move back closer to the city and have shorter commutes. Okay, now having children and being in the child rearing part of life might also lead people to be less engaged politically. Their time is occupied with their children and childcare and more cooking and cleaning and more shuttling around with the kids, and maybe that kind of preoccupation with the sort of domestic sphere leads people to be less engaged in volunteering for political activities or going to rallies or even voting. Now I know there are counter arguments to this too. It could be that people with children are more likely to get engaged because they may care more about certain issues that affect their children and that sort of thing. But it's also true that children do take up a lot of time, and that you need a lot of time and energy, and that may take a toll on political engagement. So just for the sake of argument, if we accept that having children leads to more commuting time and having children leads to less political engagement, then these two variables may be negatively related simply because they're both due to, or they're both a reflection of, this common cause of being in sort of the child rearing phase of life. So that's an example of thinking seriously about the possibility of common causes. And there are many candidates. I've just thrown out one. Okay, and there's one last thing that's it's related to what we talked about with the possibility of reverse causation. Just like a common cause and causation could be true at the same time, it could also be true that both commuting time influences political participation, but the other possibility we talked about, that political participation, people who are more interested in politics are less likely to choose a lifestyle that requires commuting, and vice versa. That those things could also be happening at the same time, so that there can be, in a sense, sort of reverse causation and causation happening at the same time. And this is sometimes referred to as simultaneity bias. If we try to only attribute that to the influence of X on Y without thinking about the simultaneous effect of Y on X, and we similarly may overestimate what's really going on in terms of X's causal effect on Y. So one way to strengthen causal evidence is to show that show the mechanism that explains the link between X and Y. So in this study, the X was commuting and Y is political participation. And so we can ask, what is the mechanism? What's the reason for that happening? And the story mentioned time, just the time it takes to commute. And so time is a possible mechanism. So longer commuting or free time. I mean, mechanism, you can think of the mechanism as being people's personal time or free time. So longer commutes lead to less personal time. And if you have less personal time, then you have more difficulty being engaged politically. Now, actually, this relationship here between M and Y would be positive. More personal time leads to more political engagement, right? But then more commuting, if commuting is X, leads to less personal time. So this first link would be negative. The second link would be positive. Now, putting those two together would produce a negative link between X and Y. Now, they actually mentioned that that was not the reason, that they had looked at that and it was not the case. And then they speculated on a second kind of mechanism, which is more the stress and sort of mental exhaustion that comes from commuting, based on some work by Kahneman. They mentioned the famous psychologist who studied people's use of time and their satisfaction with life, and found that commuting was one of the most stressful sort of periods of most people's day. So that if M, the mechanism there is stress, then more commuting leads to more stress, and more stress leads to less political participation. So the initial link here would be positive: more commuting, more stress, or mental fatigue, and then more stress leads to less sort of willingness to be engaged in political participation. Now the point of this kind of inclusion of a mediator or a causal mechanism is that if the study finds this and can show that the links are consistent, in other words, if they have data on this mechanism, if they have some kind of questions that ask about stress and mental fatigue, and they show that commuting is related to that, and then that variable again is related to political participation, that strengthens the study. Okay, now just to conclude, all of these things can be going on at once in the real world. This is a image from our book with a different example, which had to do with family dinners and drug use. But you can see in here that there's causation, reverse causation, common causes, and intervening variables or causal mechanisms. And so the real world is complex like this, and so figuring out cause and effect takes some work.